On a cold evening in 2004, on a remote sheep farm in Wyoming, USA, a 20-year-old girl suddenly disappeared and did not return home that night. But after a careful investigation, dark secrets were gradually revealed. Clara Hastings, a young girl in her early 20s, was full of energy and dreams. Growing up in a rural farming family, Clara spent her youth on the green fields of her family's farm. She loved nature, loved animals, and often spent time taking care of the sheep that her family raised. For Clara, waking up to the morning sun and the sound of sheep bleating was the best thing. However, deep inside her passionate heart was a strong desire to escape the confines of farm life. Clara always felt like she didn't belong there, that she wouldn't be a farmer forever. She often dreamed of a bright future where she could explore the outside world, learn, and do the things she loved. She wanted to be an independent woman, free from the prejudices and expectations of her family. Clara loved her father, Albert Hastings, a strict and conservative man. He was a hard worker, always taking great responsibility for maintaining the farm and the family. Albert and his wife Edith had married young and lived together on the farm where they built an idyllic life. However, after Edith's illness and death, family life changed completely. Albert became more strict, and his wife's absence left a huge void in his heart. The relationship between Clara and Albert became more strained than ever. He constantly reminded Clara of her responsibilities, placing expectations on her that she felt were impossible to meet. There were frequent heated arguments when Albert was dissatisfied with the way Clara managed the farm. He always thought that she was young and inexperienced, unable to do the work that a real farmer should do. After her mother's death, the burden on Clara's shoulders increased significantly. Not only did she have to work harder to maintain the farm, but she also had to take care of her younger siblings. With 3 younger brothers and sisters to care for, Clara always felt more like a mother than a sister. She poured all her heart into taking care of her siblings, but at the same time, it left her feeling exhausted and stressed. She had less and less time for herself, and her dreams were gradually suppressed by the increasing responsibilities. Feelings of guilt also constantly haunted Clara. She did not want to give up the farm, but she could not continue living with the oppression and conflicts with her father. She tried many ways to convince Albert of new ideas that she thought would improve the situation, but all her efforts were in vain. Albert did not accept change. He still stuck to the traditional ways, which made Clara feel even more hopeless. Every morning, when Clara woke up and looked in the mirror, she couldn't help but feel frustrated with her life. She wanted to learn and grow, but she was trapped within the walls of the farm and her father's expectations. Sometimes she thought about running away, but that thought was quickly dispelled by the anxiety of her family's responsibilities. She couldn't just abandon her siblings. But as time went on, this life felt more and more suffocating to her. Clara's life gradually became a series of tiring days. She lived with the hope that one day everything would change, and she could find the light she longed for. But deep down, she also worried that her dreams would forever remain just dreams and that she would never escape the shadow of the peasant life that she no longer wanted to live. As autumn approached, Clara would often take long walks in the fields, a place where she could escape the stresses of home. These times were a moment of rest, but reality still lingered in those quiet moments. Clara resolved to find a way to change her life. She planned her next steps, even if it meant confronting her father. As for Albert, after the death of his wife, Albert Hastings fell into a state of mental turmoil. The woman he had loved and been with for many years had left his life, leaving a void that could not be filled. His wife, Edith, was not only his life partner but also a solid support in his family life. After her death, Albert felt like everything in his life had collapsed, and that made him more irritable than ever. The loss completely changed the way Albert viewed life. He was no longer the strong, determined man he had been. Instead, he began to feel like he was losing control. As the head of the family, Albert had always felt the need to keep things within reach, but without Edith, he didn't know what to do to maintain stability for his children. This unstable mentality gradually formed evil thoughts in his heart. Albert became more sensitive to the actions of his children, especially Clara. He saw that this young girl, his eldest daughter, was gradually slipping out of his control, and he could not accept that. Whenever Clara made decisions or took actions that he did not agree with, his anger flared up, and he did not hesitate to show his power by yelling, criticizing, and even threatening. Once a loving and devoted father, the pain and uncertainty after Edith's death turned Albert into a completely different man. He began to have dark thoughts about exerting his power over his children, and this further strained his relationship with Clara. Their arguments were not only about farm work but also reflected his own inner turmoil. Albert felt he had lost not only his partner but also his leadership role in the family. He saw Clara trying to do everything on her own, which made him feel replaced. Whenever he saw his daughter decide to do something different from what he had taught her to do, he felt threatened, and this led to overreaction. Albert's mental breakdown not only affected him but also had a huge impact on his children. He could not control his anger and negative thoughts that had infiltrated his mind. Sarcasm and violence became his tools to try to regain the control he had lost. However, Albert had a dark thought that he had never considered before. It was a cold evening, the moon shining brightly over the vast fields of Hastings Farm. Clara, a young woman in her early 20s, decided to check on her sheep. It was a routine she followed every night, a way to find solace in the pressures of family life. However, the atmosphere tonight was somewhat heavy, making her feel an indescribable sense of unease. Clara walked among the sheep, unaware that her strict and domineering father, Albert, was secretly watching her from afar. Albert had been suffering for a long time since the death of his wife, Edith. Grief and anger had turned him into a different person, one without control. Edith's absence had left a huge void in his life, and he didn't know how to cope with the loss. He felt increasingly uneasy and fearful that his authority in the family was being challenged. As Clara approached the sheep, a sudden sense of nervousness came over her. Something was wrong, but she could not put her finger on it. Albert, in the darkness, could not contain his rising emotions. The image of Clara, the daughter he had once loved, had now become a symbol of his powerlessness. He felt as if Clara was taking away his control of the family, and this made him resentful. When Clara arrived, he took advantage of her loneliness and vulnerability to do things no one could have expected. Albert approached her in the darkness, his presence like a nightmare. He did not stop at showing control but went further, turning Clara's life into a real nightmare in this moment. Clara realized that the worst thing was not what had happened, but the feeling of being completely helpless before her father. After forcing Clara to endure shameful acts, a huge argument broke out between them. Clara, overwhelmed with emotions, decided that she could no longer live in silence. She was determined to reveal the truth and seek justice for herself. This was not only a fight for herself but also for other girls who might face similar situations. But Albert, in a panic and fear, did not want to lose face in front of anyone. In a fit of rage, he threw himself at Clara, demanding that she keep quiet. He could not stand to be challenged, and that anger made him a terrifying person. Clara refused her father's request, determined not to accept the abuse she had suffered. She was no longer afraid, and the pain she had buried for years now flared up like a fire. Albert, in a frenzy and determined to defend his honor, tackled Clara to the ground. A dramatic exchange ensued where the strength and will of a father collided with the courage of a young girl. In this moment, Clara felt she was fighting not only for her survival but also for her honor and humanity. But Albert's strength, fueled by pain and anger, made it difficult for her to resist. Finally, in a fateful moment, Albert grabbed a nearby stone. His next action went beyond all limits. He used the stone to hit Clara on the head, knocking her unconscious on the spot. The sound of the stone hitting her head was like a huge shock, and time seemed to stop. Clara, a young girl full of dreams and aspirations, now lay motionless on the ground. After committing the crime, Albert felt panic. He couldn't believe what had just happened, but fear and guilt took over his mind. In a panic, he dragged Clara's body into a nearby bush, trying to bury the crime he had just committed. This act was not only a heinous crime but also the tragic end of a young girl who could not find light in life. Albert stood up, looking around to make sure no one saw him. His heart was pounding in his chest, but he convinced himself that he had done the right thing. His actions were not only a defense of his family's honor but also an escape from a pain he could not face. In his mind, he had won. He had kept the truth hidden, and that comforted him for the moment. Albert then returned home, trying to keep his composure. No one could have guessed that a crime had been committed in the darkness. 2 days had passed since Clara Hastings disappeared, and anxiety was building in the small community where her family lived. People were familiar with Clara, the young girl who loved nature and cared for sheep. They began to feel her absence, but no one thought anything serious had happened. That morning, a neighbor named Mary passed Clara's farm on her way to the market. As she passed near the area where Clara tended her sheep, She suddenly smelled a strong stench, as if something was wrong. Mary stopped, her nose wrinkled, and negative thoughts began to appear in her head. She thought that maybe a sheep had died, but it turned out to be much worse. She decided to search the area, worried the stench was getting stronger, making her feel depressed. She walked step by step, trying to locate the source of the smell. After a while of searching, Mary saw a thicket of bushes where light could not penetrate. Curiosity and fear made her move closer, and when she bent down, the sight she saw was unbelievable. From the bushes, an arm protruded, a terrifying green color, making Mary feel dizzy. She couldn't believe that she was seeing a human corpse. Fear rushed over her like a tidal wave, and Mary felt as if someone had stabbed her in the heart. Time seemed to stop, and everything around her became blurry. In that terrifying moment, she realized that this was not a sheep but a human. Unable to bear it, Mary ran home in a panic, screaming in fear. She did not know what to do, but the only thought in her mind was to inform everyone about this terrible discovery. When she got home, she informed the neighbors in the village, and they immediately realized the seriousness of the situation. The neighbors, with worried faces, together called the police, asking them to come immediately to investigate. The police arrived at the scene shortly after. They quickly cordoned off the area around the bush where the body was found. The stench still lingered in the air, and the eyes of the investigators gradually turned from suspicion to seriousness. An official investigation was opened. As the police approached, they confirmed that the body was that of a young girl, and they immediately recognized her as Clara Hastings, Albert's daughter. This information came as a huge shock to everyone. Clara was a lovely girl, and the discovery of her body in such a state shocked the entire community. The police took fingerprints and conducted initial investigations, trying to collect all the evidence they could. While the investigators worked, a heavy atmosphere hung over the area. The villagers gathered around, worried and talking about what had happened. Everyone wanted to know the cause of death and what had led to this tragedy. They were familiar with the Hastings family, but now they were all in a state of utter confusion. The police quickly determined that this was a murder case. They began to investigate every little detail, from Clara's relationships to the people around her. Stories from neighbors were carefully listened to, especially those who had seen Clara recently. Information about quarrels between Clara and Albert came to light, raising suspicions among the police. Albert Hastings, Clara's father, became a suspect. He was a strict man, and his relationship with Clara had become strained since her mother's death. The police noticed that he was absent during the entire time of the crime and decided to search for him to investigate further. One of the police officers went to Albert's farm. When he arrived, he saw Albert standing in front of the door, looking nervous and worried. He saw the suspicious look in the officer's eyes and knew that something was wrong. The police asked him to come with them to the station for questioning, and Albert couldn't refuse. At the police station, Albert was asked to provide information about the time of Clara's disappearance. He tried to remain calm, but deep down, fear was rising. He began to explain that Clara hadn't come home since the night before, but the details he gave didn't quite add up. The police realized that the inconsistencies in his story could be a sign of a cover-up. The police searched Albert's home, looking for any clues that might be relevant to the case. They checked every room, every nook and cranny, and soon found several suspicious items. A large stone with bloodstains was found in the storage room, which led the police to suspect that it might have been the murder weapon. When questioned about the stone, Albert became confused and could not give a reasonable explanation. The police saw that his actions showed anxiety, and his emotional outbursts seemed to awaken deep suspicions in them. They began to convince themselves that Albert might have been involved in Clara's death. Information from the neighbors also reinforced their suspicions, suggesting that there was a history of violence between Albert and Clara. Finally, after a thorough investigation, the police had enough evidence to arrest Albert Hastings. He was charged with murder, and everything happened very quickly. In that moment, Albert realized that the truth had been revealed. Unable to hide from his actions, he had to face the consequences of the crime he had committed against his own daughter. Albert Hastings was taken by the police to prison, where he would await trial for the highest crime he had committed. Sitting in the dark cell, Albert could not escape his haunting thoughts of Clara. Images of his daughter, along with the terrible moments between father and daughter, mixed with feelings of guilt and remorse. His mind was in turmoil. Although he had convinced himself that his actions were necessary to protect his family's honor, deep down, he knew he had crossed the line. Albert's trial, which began in early 1971, attracted the attention of the entire community. The atmosphere in court was tense as villagers gathered to watch the proceedings. The evidence against Albert was clear, from the testimony of neighbors to the evidence at the scene. Evidence that Clara had suffered abuse before her death made Albert's situation even more dire. Although Albert tried to justify his actions, his reasons were not convincing enough. In the end, the jury returned a verdict. Albert Hastings was sentenced to life in prison for murder. This ending was not only a sentence for Albert but also a sad end to the tragic story of the Hastings family, leaving the community with an indelible pain and loss. Clara, a young girl full of dreams, was no more, and the price the family had to pay was too high for an unforgivable crime.